Excuse me, the committee will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any time. And without objection, Representative Shelley Pingree, the gentlewoman from Maine, shall be permitted to join the committee on the dais and be recognized for questioning of witnesses. Well, welcome everyone. Today we will explore how American farms can be part of climate solutions and examine climate-smart agricultural practices that can reduce greenhouse gas emissions and at the same time increase soil health and carbon sequestration in agricultural lands, all while helping make farms more resilient to the impacts of climate change. I'd like to recognize myself now for 5 minutes for an opening statement. Well, last week, the Select Committee on the Climate Crisis began exploring natural climate solutions. Nature gives us effective and inexpensive opportunities to keep our air and water clean and to reduce carbon pollution. Today, we will discuss similar opportunities in agriculture and how farmers are contributing to climate solutions and can do more. Farmers are on the front lines of the climate crisis. Earlier this year, the Midwest experienced extreme rains followed by severe winds and blizzard conditions across the region. The effects were devastating. The storm decimated livestock, flooded some fields for months, and left millions of acres unable to be planted. Some areas along the Missouri River are still flooded now, 7 months later. Similar stories can be told in other parts of our nation, whether it's fires in the west or hurricanes in the southeast. In fact, extreme weather conditions made the past year one of the worst agricultural years in decades. The climate crisis is increasingly putting America's agriculture at risk through harsher floods, longer droughts, unexpected frost, and other extreme weather events. You know, anyone who eats should care about the climate crisis. In August, with Fred Yoder, I visited with Florida agriculture leaders that included citrus, strawberries, dairy farmers, timber, and ranching interests, and along with agricultural extension scientists from the University of Florida. And they advised me that rising temperature and extreme events are impacting their operations and that they need help adapting. And they impressed upon me that they also want to be part of the solution to the climate crisis. And they are not alone. As farmers across America increasingly wrestle with the impacts of higher temperatures, they're also looking for opportunities to help solve the climate crisis. Through land management strategies and smart partnerships, they can have an enormous impact. America's farms are uniquely situated to become powerful carbon sinks, all while becoming more resilient to the impacts of severe weather events. In the United States, agriculture is responsible for nearly 10% of annual greenhouse gas emissions, which primarily come from nitrogen fertilizer application and livestock. But through innovative and proven conservation practices that we'll hear about today, they can reduce these emissions. And farmers are already doing a lot to combat the climate crisis, and we must invest in them to do even more. Climate-smart agricultural practices such as reducing tillage, planting cover crops, and diversifying crop rotations can increase farmland's potential to sequester carbon and mitigate climate change. These practices often improve soil health and can also reduce costs, increase yields, and make farms more resilient to the impacts of extreme weather. One of the most important things we can do to fight the climate crisis is to protect our farmlands. In the last several decades, we've lost millions of acres of agricultural lands to development. Protecting current farmland from development reduces the pressure to convert natural areas to new cropland, leaving intact the forests, grasslands, and wetlands to provide the climate benefits that we discussed last week. Congress has already taken some steps to incentivize climate-smart agricultural practices. Congressionally authorized USDA programs such as the Conservation Stewardship Program and the Environmental Quality Incentives Program offer farmers technical and financial assistance to increase conservation activities. The Conservation Reserve Program pays farmers to voluntarily retire land from production for less resource-intensive uses. And the Agricultural Conservation Easement Program permanently protects farmland through agricultural conservation easements. Congress passed important improvements in the 2018 Farm Bill, which increased and expanded upon these initiatives. The USDA also administers the Rural Energy Savings Program and the Renewable Energy for America program, which helps support energy efficiency and renewable energy in rural communities. And of course, the renewable fuel standards and federal tax incentives for wind and solar have provided sustained economic benefits to farmers in rural counties across the country. But there is more work to do. We can help the agricultural sector increase their critical role in carbon storage, and we can help farmers maintain and increase their profitability while also helping to solve the climate crisis. So today we have experts here who are going to help us develop those solutions and help us turn all of these things into reality. At this time, I'll recognize, since Mr. Graves is not here, Mr. Griffith, if you'd like to make any opening comments, you're welcome, and Mr. Graves will still get his opportunity when he arrives.
Well, I appreciate that, Madam Chair, but I anticipate that Ranking Member Graves will be here shortly.
Okay. Well, if the witnesses don't mind, when he arrives, we may break in between witnesses and have him give some opening statements, or he might want to just jump right into to questions as well. So without objection, members who wish to enter opening statements into the record may have 5 business days to do so. And now we'll move on to our terrific panel before us today. I'll introduce each of you, and then we'll go one by one with testimony. First is Dr. Jennifer Moore Kucera. She's the Climate Initiative Director at American Farmland Trust. She oversees their efforts to help states develop innovative policies and programs that can maximize agricultural opportunities to combat the climate crisis. Prior to joining AFT, she served in USDA's Natural Resource Conservation Service as West Region Soil Health Team Leader and as the co-director for the USDA Northwest Climate Hub. Next, my good friend, Mr. Fred Yoder is a 4th-generation farmer. He grows corn, soybeans, and wheat in Ohio on his family's farm and operates a retail seed business. He is also the co-chair of Solutions for the Land and advocates for agricultural solutions to sustain productivity, enhance climate resilience, and help the United States reach sustainable development goals. Next, Ms. Tina Owens is the Senior Director of Agricultural Funding and Communication at Danone, North America. Her work focuses on regenerative agriculture practices and financing. She has spent 2 decades leading sustainability and strategic sourcing in the food industry. Next, Mr. Viral Amain is the Vice President of Commercial Development and Strategy at DTE Energy Resources. DTE Energy is a diversified energy company and develops renewable energy services projects, including a dairy-based renewable gas processing facility in Wisconsin. Before we turn to you, Dr. Moore Kucera, I'm going to welcome the ranking member and see if you would like 5 minutes to make some opening remarks.
Thank you for not late shaming me too much. I apologize for being late, but thank you all for being here. I just very quickly want to say that I appreciate you all being here today. Agriculture is a very important opportunity, very important natural resource managers that have the opportunity, as I indicated, to be significant participants in our efforts to sequester greenhouse gases. If you look across the globe, approximately, I guess the average for agriculture is emitting about 24% of the greenhouse gases in different countries. In the United States, it's about 8%, indicating it's a more efficient agricultural practices here in the United States, which does support our efforts to export agricultural products, because globally that helps to reduce greenhouse gas emissions when you look at global averages. It's similar to the policies that we've discussed in this committee in regard to natural gas. Natural gas, U.S. natural gas, according to the National Energy Technology Laboratories, is over 40% cleaner than Russian natural gas. When when supplied to European and Asian countries. So once again, using U.S. gas results in lower greenhouse gas emissions globally. Do we need to do a better job implementing best management practices and investing in R&D to ensure that we're maximizing opportunities with our farmers, with agricultural lands? Absolutely. To figure out how we do a better job enhancing sequestration and do it in a way that's complementary to the objectives of our farming community. So with that, I'm going to yield back, and thank you, Madam Chair.
Right, Dr. Kucera, Kucera, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chair Castor, Ranking Member Graves, and honorable members of the committee. I am Jennifer Kucera, the Climate Initiative Director for American Farmland Trust, an organization founded 40 years ago to help protect farmland, advance sound farming practices, and keep farmers on the land. I thank you for the opportunity to testify and applaud the committee for exploring the critical issue of agriculture and climate change. Our nation's crop and ranch lands offer immediately available, low-cost, and proven ways to address climate change by sequestering carbon and reducing greenhouse gas emissions. No other option to combat climate change comes with more of the co-benefits we need for a sustainable future. It's imperative we work across the political spectrum to make this opportunity a reality. Our farms and our future depend upon it. Climate change threatens lives, livelihoods, our food security, and our economy, and is no longer a distant problem. Record high temperatures, drought, wildfires, storms, and floods are becoming more intense and frequent. Collectively, these events negatively impact our crops, soil, and water. You're probably already seeing one or more of these impacts in your own districts. As we speak, Northern California is suffering from intense wildfires in what has become a new normal. Agriculture contributes to these challenges as the net emitter of more than 580 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalents per year. However, these emissions can be substantially reduced or even offset with continued adoption of what are commonly referred to as regenerative, climate-smart, or soil health practices. Two proven, low-cost soil health practices are cover crops and conservation tillage. Working with a USDA colleague, we estimate that if U.S. farmers adopted cover crops on 25% of our cropland and conservation tillage on 100% of our tillable acres, we could reduce nearly 150 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalents per year, or 1/4 of the total U.S. agricultural emissions. And there are numerous other practices available that can further reduce these levels, which we can discuss during questions. AFT recently documented the co-benefits of soil health practices on 4 farms from across the U.S. After implementing new soil practices, they found that in addition to reducing their greenhouse gas emissions by an average of 379%, these same farms significantly cut nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment losses and increased yields. The 3 row crop farmers increased their average net income by $42 per acre per year. These gains, however, are not possible unless we keep farmland as farmland. According to USDA, over 25 million acres of farm and ranch land were converted to development between 1982 and 2015. Once land is lost to development, we lose the ability to further sequester carbon, and the remaining lands are subject to increased pressures. Encouraging agricultural easements and compact urban growth are 2 ways to protect farmland while reducing transportation emissions. Today, I am here as a scientist, not as a policy expert. Nonetheless, I want to share some perspectives from AFT policy experts. We call on Congress to seize the opportunities and make agriculture a key partner in fighting climate change. This could be achieved through a comprehensive climate bill or integrated into a transformational farm bill. First, Congress should expand upon the successful voluntary farm bill conservation programs. Historically, these programs have more demand than available funding. Second, we encourage Congress to leverage other federal programs and state-level innovations, such as the pilot programs in Iowa and Illinois that offer reductions on crop insurance premiums for cover crop adoption. Third, we need additional research on practices that help address climate change and quantify their impacts. This knowledge will inform farmers and ensure good, sound public investments. Lastly, we must find new ways to fund these practices and reward farmers for reducing greenhouse gases. This can include engaging consumers and private companies through environmental markets, supply chain management, and labels. Producers are struggling to make ends meet. Such efforts are models for encouraging best practices and keeping producers viable. Our nation's farm and ranch lands have numerous scalable opportunities to address climate change with the co-benefits we need for our future. We at AFT are excited to continue this conversation and serve as a resource as you move forward. Thank you once again for the opportunity to testify.
Thank you very much. Mr. Yoder, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, good afternoon, Chair Castor, Ranking Member Graves, and members of the Select Committee on Crisis, the Climate Crisis. I thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today to share some of my thoughts and experiences involving opportunities for agriculture to contribute solutions to climate change and challenges. My name is Fred Yoder, and I'm a fourth-generation farmer who has lived and farmed near Plain City, Ohio for over 45 years. Along with my wife, Debbie, and our 2 children and their families, we grow corn, soybeans, and wheat. We've also operated a retail farm seed business for over 40 years and sell all kinds of seed to farmers, including biotech, conventional, and also the ones that grow organic crops. We also offer precision technologies to help farmers increase their efficiencies. I'm testifying today as both a working farmer and also co-chair of Solutions from the Land, a farmer-led, non-governmental organization that works to place America's farms, ranches, and forests at the forefront of resolving food system, energy, environmental, and climate challenges, and achieving global sustainable development goals. I want to begin by affirming one important fact. Although the topic we are discussing today can be politically divisive, my personal observations and experiences have taught me there is evidence that climate is indeed changing. I see it happening before my very eyes. Science isn't perfect, but it's the very best tool we have to make assessments. And the science on this topic is clear. It's time to stop debating whether the climate is changing because of natural or human activities, and come together and advance proven, pragmatic, and innovative agricultural solutions that benefit producers, the public, and the planet. We as an industry are also uniquely positioned to be the ones that can deliver the solutions. In Central Ohio, where I farm, we have already experienced one of the most difficult growing seasons I can ever remember in my career. In my written testimony, I discussed the need to utilize the 3 complementing and interlocking climate smart agriculture, or CSA, strategies to address climate challenges. First, sustainably increasing agricultural productivity and livelihoods. The second one is enhancing adaptive capacity and improving resilience, especially in our soils. And third, delivering ecosystem services, sequestering carbon, and reducing and/or avoiding greenhouse gas emissions. The reason CSA is an effective strategy for engendering farmer participation and support is the approach places farmers at the center of all climate discussions and decisions. I also discuss a number of guiding principles that should be understood and followed as we determine agricultural response strategies to a changing climate. Science-based decision-making should be the foundation for the adoption of climate-smart technologies and practices for sustainable agriculture and global food production. There is no silver bullet solution for enhancing the resilience of agriculture. Solution strategies must adopt a systems approach. While climate change will pose serious changes for the agriculture and forestry sectors, it will also present new opportunities in the form of near-term, high-value, and lower-cost mitigation services these sectors can provide in the form of carbon dioxide captured by crops, grasses, trees, and sequestered in the soil. Emission reductions from improved agricultural management practices. Emissions that are avoided through the production and use of renewable energy and fuels and bio-based products. So what can you all do to help us? First, you can call for increased federal funding for conservation tillage, cover crop, biogas programs administered through USDA NRCS, environmental quality incentives, conservation stewardship, and regional conservation partnership program. They're very good people in these positions. We just need more of them. You can call to rebuild the capacity of NRCS, state conservation agencies, and local conservation districts to provide much-needed technical assistance in writing and implementing CSA plans, providing funding for our nation's land-grant universities, and expand CSA research and extension work. We can offset fossil fuel emissions by using biomass to produce renewable energy and biomass-based production. You can restore USDA's ability to conduct agriculture and economic research in support of CSA. You can enable, through proper funding, USDA network of climate hubs to develop and deliver science-based, regional-specific information and technologies to farmers and natural resource managers. Finally, I thank you for providing a real farmer an opportunity to speak to you in this critically important topic, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Yoder. Ms. Owens, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Good afternoon, Chair Castor, Ranking Member Graves, and members of the committee. Thank you for holding this hearing and putting a spotlight on the climate crisis, one of the greatest challenges before us as a society. My name is Tina Owens, and I am honored to be here on behalf of Danone North America as its Director of U.S. Agriculture. Danone is a global food company that has been in the dairy business for 100 years and employs approximately 5,000 employees in the U.S. We buy directly from more than 700 farms across the country for our most important ingredient, which is milk. You may know us best for our yogurt brands that include Dannon, Oikos, and Activia. Danone's overarching vision of one planet, one health drives our sense of purpose and responsibility, not only to our shareholders, but also the many other stakeholders of our business, including our suppliers, our customers, our consumers, and our farmer partners. My role is to lead and coordinate Danone North America's investments with our farming partners. Simply put, our business cannot exist without the individuals and families who are willing to take on the daily work and personal risk that is farming in America. Their success is our success. As a major food company, we can plainly see that the climate crisis adds an immense additional layer of risk for our food system. Our farms and food businesses are among the first to feel the impact of this extra volatility. It is clear that to reduce the most extreme risk associated with climate change, agriculture must be a central part of the equation. To meet this challenge, we are actively pursuing new models of working with farmers that incentivize the adoption of new management practices that can address climate change. Our largest focus is on soil health. In 2018, we launched a 5-year, $6 million soil health initiative aimed at capturing carbon and overcoming common obstacles to building soil health management systems. This program, which targets both economic resilience and environmental impact, is a strong starting point for Congress to develop complementary policy options. Our approach has the following 3 pillars. Pillar number 1 is about science. While there is ample research on how soil captures carbon, better understanding of regional differences is key. We have worked with several university partners to help provide a scientific baseline, economic analysis, and soil sampling. A coordinated approach between government and research institutions for improving soil health allows all stakeholders to better understand the potential for different farming systems to capture carbon and reduce net greenhouse gas emissions. Pillar number 2 is about data. Data is vital for tracking and verifying progress and improving the carbon capture in soil. We partner with the Eco Practices platform to help us and our farmer partners understand both the return on investment for improving the health of soil and the environmental impacts of soil health practices. When new activities are implemented, farms then have the data to understand the impact of their change in management practices. Pillar number 3 is about incentives. We believe that improving soil health can provide a return on investment to farms, but the short-term costs of implementing these practices can often stand in the way. Since improving soil health takes a holistic approach, we need to incentivize farms so that the benefits can be realized in the fewest number of crop cycles. We're working with the USDA to incentivize practices for soil health, and ideally would create contracts that cover multiple practices over multiple years. In many cases, it takes just 3 to 4 core practices to achieve real climate results. In conclusion, the climate crisis may be felt first by those who are closest to the land, but its impact will eventually touch everyone who produces, sells, buys, and eats food. While there is no single solution when it comes to our complex agricultural landscape, building new and lasting soil health management solutions holds promise for the climate benefits we need as a society. These systems must be scalable relative to the size of the climate crisis, and they must support the livelihood of farmers on which we all rely. While the work of one company cannot bring all the climate solutions we need, our scale and our partnerships have the power to show that the impact of soil health on the climate crisis is real, measurable, and replicable. We must act together now to scale similar impact through policy and investment in American farms. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. I would be happy to answer any questions the committee may have.
Thank you very much. Mr. Amin, welcome. You have 5 minutes to present your testimony.
Thank you. Chairwoman Castor, Ranking Member Graves, and members of the Select Committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today. My name is Viral Amin, and I'm the Vice President of Commercial Development and Strategy for DTE Energy's Power and Industrial Group based in Ann Arbor, Michigan. At DTE Energy, we believe that climate change is one of the defining public policy issues of our time. We applaud this committee for taking the initiative to understand what can be done. Today, I'd like to introduce you to renewable natural gas, a product that's made entirely from waste and has a potential to deliver significant greenhouse gas reductions while also improving air and water quality and creating well-paying jobs. Renewable natural gas, or RNG, is exactly what it sounds like. It's natural gas made from renewable resources. Derived from methane created by the decomposition of organic matter, rather than being extracted from underground fossil-based resources, RNG is chemically identical to the natural gas that most of us use every day. Livestock operations, such as dairy and hog farms, can be a renewable source of methane. Manure management practices are a significant source of greenhouse gas emissions in this country. Manure is often stored in uncovered lagoons, leading to the release of methane into the atmosphere, which is 25 times more potent than carbon dioxide. RNG projects capture methane by diverting manure to large enclosed storage tanks called anaerobic digesters. The captured methane is then processed to remove impurities and produce a product that can be transported and delivered anywhere in this country through our existing natural gas pipeline infrastructure and can be utilized by end customers without any limitations or changes to their equipment. The primary use for RNG today is as a fuel replacement in trucks, buses, and cars that are otherwise powered by traditional fossil-based natural gas. RNG fuel allows for a carbon footprint that is lower than even electric vehicles due to the avoidance of farm-based methane emissions. Furthermore, because RNG is primarily used by medium and heavy-duty trucks, emissions of sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxides, and particulates are significantly lower than those of diesel-fueled vehicles. DTE is working with 10 dairy farms in Wisconsin to develop RNG projects. We've already committed $140 million and are looking at more opportunities in other states. We like that our investments are driving not only significant greenhouse gas emission reductions, but that these projects are creating economic and environmental wins for the agricultural communities in which these projects reside. The financial challenges currently faced by dairy farms due to low milk prices, combined with the additional pressure from local communities to improve water quality and reduce odor, can be partially mitigated by RNG projects in several ways. First, DTE pays dairy farmers a share of the revenues earned from the sale of RNG, allowing these primarily family-owned businesses to realize value from a waste byproduct. Second, we create new well-paying jobs in order to develop, operate, maintain, and support the complex systems required to produce RNG. Third, the process used to produce RNG can reduce the number of pathogens within the manure and thereby lower the risk of groundwater contamination. And last, but not of least importance to dairy communities, many of the volatile compounds that contribute to odor are destroyed in the RNG production process. We believe that RNG is a unique solution in the battle against climate change. Harmful methane emissions are captured to fuel vehicles, allowing the transportation sector to significantly lower its carbon footprint. American farmers benefit financially, well-paying jobs are created, and both air and water quality in rural communities can be improved. In order to encourage investment and expand access to RNG, project developers require stable and transparent policy mechanisms that promote the use of low-carbon fuels and clean energy. We ask this committee to understand, support, and help stabilize existing policies that have driven investment to date and develop new and additional frameworks that enable the market to realize the full potential of RNG. These additional mechanisms could include the allocation of funds for R&D to drive technology advancement, tax incentives that are at parity with other renewable energy sources, and to promote the development of natural gas-powered vehicles or other RNG uses. RNG is a prime opportunity available today to reduce methane emissions economically, decrease reliance on fossil fuels, and support American farmers and rural economies. I appreciate your attention, and I look forward to answering your questions. Thank you.
Terrific. Fantastic job from all the witnesses. At this time, I recognize myself for 5 minutes for questions. So the existing Farm Bill has a number of conservation initiatives. They have been crucial in providing technical assistance to farmers and financial incentives to help implement climate-smart ag practices, such as the Conservation Stewardship Program, Environmental Quality Incentives Program, the Conservation Reserve Program. They all seem to move us in the right direction. But if agriculture is going to be part of a major climate solutions for the land and from the land, it seems like we are nowhere near the scale that we need to be. Mr. Yoder, give us some advice on the scale and how significantly we need to scale up these initiatives. Which ones work especially well, and which ones need to be expanded in some way?
Well, to be clear, there's some really good programs that you just mentioned that we can utilize. But the problem we have is we just don't have enough boots on the ground. I know farmers have been waiting for up to 2 years before they get their, like a nutrient management plan that they can improvise in, as they go through this. I would like to see a program where, and maybe I'm more of an innovator, but I would like to see a program where you can be involved with these programs, but also have some sort of safe harbor provision where, there's farmers out there trying new things and things that we haven't even thought about yet that might be a really, really good solution to some of these things. And so, again, it's going to have to be, you're going to have a lot of research out there and a lot of places where different things work in different watersheds. And that's the one thing that we don't have the luxury of doing as a one-size-fits-all. There's plenty of watersheds out there. There's plenty of different volumes of water. There's plenty of different soil types. There's thousands of different soil types. So we can't find a one-size-fits-all, but we can provide tools for the toolbox that they can all implement on their particular farm. And this is a massive undertaking, but the potential is just enormous. In fact, I look at it as the low-hanging fruit for climate change solutions.
So to speak.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I was on our trip to Gainesville and the University of Florida and then out on the timber ranch in August. I was impressed with the depth and breadth of knowledge by our agricultural extension service that through the land-grant universities in partnership with state and local officials, it seems like they're trusted, but they are just skimming the surface right now. So I think, does everyone agree that we'd need more scientists and technical help for farmers and agriculture? Good. Ms. Kucera, you have a lot of experience with this. Talk to us about the scale of these current Farm Bill initiatives, and then what's not in under the Farm Bill rubric that we should be thinking about as well.
Are you referring to the conservation?
Yeah, talk to us first about how much we would need to scale those initiatives up.
There's a lot of room for opportunity and scaling, specifically targeting soil health practices that have a lot of co-benefits that I mentioned earlier about improved water quality, air quality, water quantity, and all of these issues to try to bring it back to other mitigation opportunities, reduce floods and reduced inputs. So there's a lot of opportunities that we can have and research, and as Mr. Yoder mentioned, increased boots on the ground and resources for our conservation service and extension organizations, I think is really critical.
Ms. Owens, you were specifically focused on soil health and advised us to invest in the science there, technical expertise, and it occurred to me that, boy, the United States of America, we've always been a leader in these type of agricultural, scientific initiatives. And you think of the challenge with increasing carbon pollution around the rest of the world, and the developing world, and the technical help they are going to need to sequester carbon and implement smart farming practices. You have an international company here. How important is it that the United States of America is a leader and develops these technologies that we can export to other countries?
Well, thank you, Chair. For our own part, we are an international company headquartered out of Paris. However, the U.S. is actually our largest single market. So as a company, we are focused on the impact that we can have within the U.S. You and I have spoken a little bit earlier about the United States' ability to actually position itself as a leader for practices around the world, and I agree that that is an important point. You had also asked earlier around scale, and while it is important that we align our research institutions and the government towards a single goal, such as soil health and climate mitigation, to the point made from some of the other witnesses, I would like to add that boots on the ground is actually a very clear need. And one of the ways that we could offer a new partnership to do that is actually utilizing the scale of international food companies or others that are operating within the U.S. and utilize the supply chain that we have for additional implementation with those farms with which we partner. Today, that's not the model that's used. It's state by state, farm by farm. And we would open the door to having a conversation about a new day where the existing model of the Farm Bill and the way that payouts happen is used, but at a different scale than farm by farm, county by county, state by state.
Thank you. Mr. Graves, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ms. Owen, if U.S. is your largest market, we welcome your headquarters being relocated here. We have French speakers in Louisiana. So, Dr. Moore, Kucera, I wanted to make sure I understood some of your comments earlier. Right now, under the Farm Bill we did last Congress, we have about $2 billion invested in conservation programs, voluntary programs. You indicated, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, I want to make sure I'm understanding. You indicated basically building upon those or recalibrating those or introducing new ones or all the above. Could you clarify?
Well, actually, that gets more into the policy component of AFT. I'm here as a scientific technical expert, and I would have to defer to our policy team to further expand on those questions.
Okay, if you could do that in writing after the hearing, that would be helpful. I want to understand if you believe that some of the existing conservation programs, or if your organization does, if those are sufficient, if they were expanded, more dollars invested, or if you're talking about new types of incentives or voluntary programs, just better
I
understand
think we
that.
need both opportunities, actually.
Okay, so expanding on existing,
What
but
we
perhaps
can.
also adding new. Okay, thank you. Mr. Yoder, in your testimony, and also according to some of the folks that we've met with, I understand that NRCS technical staff may be insufficient to address the demand. Could you expand upon that a little bit and where you see that as being a problem?
Sure. In my state, Mr. Terry Cosby is the leader of the NRCS in our state. And one of the things that he's is hampered with is there's not even a member of NRCS staff in every county, and so there's a lot of demand, and these people are fantastic, but they had a hiring freeze on for a while. I guess now they can hire again.
So how does that impede our ability to advance conservation initiatives?
Well, one of the things that you find out here in the countryside is the culture of agriculture. You know, the thing that is sort of difficult is all productivity is not created equal. So you can have very productive farms. And in some ways, it's almost, I don't want to blame the land-grant universities, but we were always told you add this, and this, and you'll get, a crop. And it's true. But we haven't been paying a lot of attention to the soil health. When you look at the amount of topsoil we've burnt through the last 60 years, it's terrible. And if we burn through the same amount of topsoil the next 60 years, then we won't have anything left.
Do you participate in any of the conservation programs?
I don't participate in any of those programs, but I every bit of my farm, my 1,500 acres is all no-till, and we raise cover crops on every single acre.
That's great. That's great. Last question for you, Mr. Yoder. As you know, over the last few decades, there have been substantial changes in ethanol policies that have had an impact on crops grown, including proliferation of corn. How have you viewed that as having an impact on kind of the land use, soil, conservation, and health?
Well, data will tell you that you can actually build soil by raising corn. And one of the things that you hear in the media and other places and some NGOs that big bad corn is tearing our soil away, and it's not true. But if it's done no-till. The other thing too is when say for instance bioethanol, the way we weighed bioethanol 15, 20 years ago was nothing like it is today. So today, if you do it with conservation practices, you can actually, even with conventional bioethanol, you're 35% better than petroleum gasoline. But you can get up to actually qualify, statistic-wise, but that it's an advanced biofuel. So it's different today. The improvements we've made with bioethanol performance, also biodiesel, is phenomenal. So as it keeps getting better and better, we have to be recognizing that it's not the same as it was just a few years ago. So we're very, very much more efficient today than we were ever.
Thank you. I'm trying to get our chair down in Louisiana so you can see our green diesel facility in Louisiana. Last question very quickly, Mr. Aman. You mentioned the renewable natural gas. You mentioned the need to transport it, obviously, to the extent we move to more natural gas vehicles, renewable natural gas vehicles, you're going to change sort of the transportation routes that they would go. So I assume that means that we're going to need natural gas, renewable natural gas infrastructure to be able to transport that gas to the right locations. Is that fair?
That's very fair. We absolutely depend on natural gas infrastructure. And as this market grows, we see continued development of that infrastructure is very necessary.
We would need to build new natural gas pipelines in order to transport the gas to places where it's needed.
Absolutely.
Thank you. You're back.
Next is Ms. Brownlee, but I want to say when I was able to visit Ventura County, you wouldn't think of it out there in the West as being a big farming community, but more strawberries than just about anywhere else. But Congresswoman Brownlee took me to a tomato grower who has a very sustainable practice, and it can be a model. It was very impressive. So you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank the panel for being here. Dr. Moore, Kucera, I wanted to ask a question. I know that the University of California at Davis has been doing some research around composting, and that composting mixed with cover crops is a better solution than just cover crops in terms of reducing the carbon footprint. At least that's what their study is saying, and certainly now in California, there's a law now called California's Healthy Soils Program, which farmers who are doing this can get some assistance for continuing to do it. So I think you stated in your testimony that you've been doing some research around composting as a greenhouse gas reduction tool. Could you share with us a little bit about that research?
Well, we haven't been doing research specifically on that topic, but it's one of the practices that we're looking at to address the contribution of greenhouse gas reduction and carbon sequestration potential across the U.S., coupling Comet Planner, the USDA tool for that, And so compost, there have been very successful programs in California applying that waste stream on rangelands with significant increases to soil carbon contents. And so that's a very encouraging program. And then, as you mentioned, coupling compost. And as we add conservation practices together, they often become more synergistic. So coupling compost with cover cropping then enhances that cover crop to perform the functions that it's designed to do. So the synergies are really important, and then also taking that waste out of that stream is a significant reduction that can be had.
Mr. Yoder, you said no-till cover crops. Do you use composting also, or?
I sure do.
Yep.
I love chicken litter, too.
Very good.
My neighbors
Very
don't
good.
exactly like it when I put it on, but we also use a product called ComTill, which is we basically composted biosolids. It doesn't smell at all, but you put that soil amendment with additional cover crops, and I can't believe how my soil has improved over the last 15 years. I mean, you know, it sounds kind of old and goofy, but my dad said, you know, all I ask when you take the farm is you leave in better shape. It's the most productive it's ever been, and it's because of some of these practices.
I've also been told that, you know, one way to collect more carbon in the soil is to begin to manipulate the seeds so that the seeds are producing longer roots into the soil. Has there been any research that anybody is aware of around that piece?
Well, there
Mr.
certainly
Yoder?
is. There's certainly lots of research on and selection for genetics. And in fact, one of the things that really aid the deep penetration of roots is actually no-till, because as you have a crop and you have roots that decay, the porosity of the soil is greatly increased, and so the water. One of the greatest things that ever happened to me, this was years ago, I went to a field day, and they opened up a field tile that had been, this farm had been no-tilled for many years, and I thought, well, because everybody thought, I mean, conventional wisdom says, well, the ground is obviously hard and can't get, they put a smoke bomb in that tile, and all over the field, the smoke came out, and it just told me the porosity of that soil was better than any kind of conventional soil I've ever had. That's when I decided I'm doing something wrong, and that's when I decided to switch to no-till.
Very good. And, you know, it's just, Mr. Yoder, in terms of all the good things that you're doing on your farm, would a carbon credit or a carbon fee be something that you would want to take advantage of?
You betcha. I'd love to see, us, you know, this is a great example of this year in Ohio. About 50% of the crops did not get planted. And luckily, we're in the retail business. We sold a lot of cover crop seed to get on those bare fields. And there was some help from NRCS as well as the whole market facilitation program. And to get farmers to just put their toe in the water and see what a cover crop will do. Because there is such a thing called a fallow degree, where ground is fallow and you don't have anything growing. The microbes all dry up and go away and die. So it's important for me to, no matter what, have something growing on that farm, that field at all times, and that way it's ready for the next crop.
Thank you so much. My time is up, and I yield back, Madam Chair.
Mr. Carter, you recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate that. Thank you all for being here. This is extremely important. I've always said as we address climate change, we cannot leave rural America behind. We've got to make sure that we include it. I have the honor and privilege of representing a very rural area, and particularly in the western part of my district in South Georgia. We have a lot of agriculture, and it's extremely important to our economy. Number one economy and number one industry in the state of Georgia is agriculture. So very proud of that. But, you know, the American farmer literally feeds the world. We have to remember that, and we have to make sure that we do everything we can. A lot of people take it for granted. You ask people a lot of times, where do you get your groceries from? They say from the grocery store. You know, they don't understand where it comes from, and that's why I'm just such a great fan of the farmers, and particularly in our area. Precision agriculture. Ms. Owens, you're familiar with that? Okay, and that's certainly something over the last decade that we've really stressed. And I just wanted to ask you, Do you think that prescription agriculture can be a way that we can bring down carbon emissions as well as save money for farmers?
That's a great question. Thank you, Congressman Carter. The answer is definitely yes. And I talked about data in my opening statement, and we are partnered with a platform called Eco Practices, which is part of Sustainable Environmental Consultants. And they are actually working on aggregating all of the different data points from farms, but bundling it in a way that the farmer can actually make sense of it and make really detailed decisions based off of it. So whether it's the data from their combine, from my John Deere, or the economic system that they use to track what's happening on their farm or how they're tracking yield. What we're working on now is actually how you use that precision ag information to project for the farmer as they adopt soil-friendly practices, how it actually contributes to their profitability over time and how it projects to help with their resilience related to climate change.
How important is broadband to rural areas and to precision agriculture?
Well, you would need broadband in order to have the farm have access to all the different tools that are available today. So
How can we help? I serve on the Energy and Commerce Committee, and this is something we talk about, getting broadband to the rural areas. How, what can we do?
well, I think it would be interesting to have a policy that broadband is actually a requirement. I myself have always lived in a rural area. I have always had terrible internet, so I would love it if the committee would make a recommendation around broadband related to agriculture, because it would affect me as well.
Would it help you, Mr. Yoder?
Thank you for bringing up broadband. You bet it would, because all these new technologies that we're enjoying today, whether it's, it's integrated with the machinery itself, it's all dependent on signals, either from internet or from satellites or from phone lines or whatever. It's absolutely crucial. The problem we have is lack of capacity. We're pretty good where I'm at right now, from just out of Columbus, Ohio. But I talk to my friends out in the bare spots. It's terrible.
It's awful in South Georgia, let me tell you.
Absolutely awful. But that's a big part. Data is a big part. Precision is big. We are precision ag dealers as well. And my goodness, I'll give you an example of how important data or precision is. We put a high-speed planting kit on our planter, and we literally saved 3 days of planting.
Absolutely.
And this year, we had a minimum of 10 days. That was it that we had to plant, and we got ours planted.
All right, let me get to one other thing that I want to mention. Tier 4 engines. Are you familiar with that? The Tier 4 engine, the EPA has gone to, now they're requiring Tier 4 engines. We had a problem with this with our bar pilots, our harbor pilots. They couldn't actually build the boat the size they needed it to in order to fit the Tier 4 engines. Now I've got the farmers coming to me and saying, they're requiring me to have a Tier 4 engine. I can't buy wheels that'll get through the rows and the crops. And the thing about the Tier 4 engines is that the environmental benefit you get from going from a 3 to a 4 is just not as good as it was going from a 2 to a 3. And Ms. Owens or Mr. Yoder, any of y'all have any experience with that?
We experience it every day. We have the transition to Tier 4, which are fine. That's like a big giant catalytic converter. But with our Tier 4 semis and big tractor, you got to have the DEF, what's that, diesel emissions fluid or whatever.
Right.
And anyway, it's a pain in the rear end.
Sure it is. Well, thank y'all all. Ag is extremely important. I know that's why we're here. But just out of curiosity, y'all know what the #1 forestry state in the nation is? It's the state of Georgia. Thank you very much, and I yield back, Madam Chair.
I've heard this. Next is Mr. Huffman, and I do want to say, Mr. Huffman, we've all been thinking about you and your district with the raging wildfires in Northern California, so it's good that you came back for the hearing. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and appreciate all of the concern many of my colleagues have expressed. My district just got through the last of a particularly harrowing windy night with pretty limited damage, so we think we're in a better place today. The last exchange between Mr. Carter and Mr. Yoder and others about broadband and much of the conversation we're having here today really highlight the fact that there are aspects of this problem-solving exercise when it comes to agriculture that really can bring us together. And I think there's so many things that we share common interest in. But before we go further into that, this is the obligatory point where I have to push back on Mr. Graves for his pep rally on behalf of natural gas, okay? Those of us that believe we're in the middle of a climate crisis, I think also have to accept that we just don't have time for fake solutions. And the idea that somehow U.S. natural gas, if it outcompetes Russian natural gas, is somehow going to make us better in the face of this climate crisis is a little bit like the captain of the Titanic saying our only choice is to steer the ship into a U.S. iceberg or a Russian iceberg. I think we've got to change course here, folks, and we know that at somewhere between 3 and 3.5% loss from the wellhead to the point of combustion, natural gas is just as bad for the climate as coal. So let's stop pretending that promoting U.S. or any other natural gas is a solution to this climate crisis. It's just not. It's actually going to make it worse. But, Mr. Amin, I do want to believe that renewable natural gas, as part of our portfolio of solutions for making agriculture part of the solution instead of a 10% net emitter, could be something that we could do. I want to give you a chance to address that potential friction, though. If we believe from a policy perspective we need less reliance on fossil fuels and natural gases that are not renewable, but we think you're onto something that could be a good idea, is there a way to reconcile those two, or is the success of your industry absolutely dependent on continuing to build out this fossil fuel infrastructure that, frankly, takes us in the wrong direction on the climate crisis?
So we believe that renewable natural gas is a near-term and immediate solution that's available today commercially to help resolve the climate crisis. There are other carbon mitigating solutions out there. Electrification gets discussed quite a bit. That's a longer-term solution, and it's not applicable to every end use. In particularly,
I guess what I'm asking specifically is if we want to support renewable natural gas, do we necessarily have to support the bigger play on natural gas infrastructure and natural gas dependency that includes an awful lot of non-renewable?
we certainly depend on natural gas infrastructure. We need pipelines.
I think that unfortunately answered the question. To the rest of you, I'm wondering, when we talk about all of these exciting practices, no-till practices and cover crops, and there were less specific references to other practices that can make a tremendous difference. Ms. Owens, you talked about some of that. I have people in my district, like the Marin Carbon Project, that are doing a lot of research on this, and they believe it shows a lot of potential. But I'm really wondering, if we're told that agriculture is 10% of our greenhouse gas emissions in this country, what would it take to make agriculture part of the solution, to either get to zero or net positive? Have any of you run the numbers? Is there a set of specific practices that could be scaled up to specific levels that you could recommend to us? I would just open that up to any of you that want to elaborate.
So that's some of the research that we're working on today. I mentioned that with current and projected adoption of cover crop and conservation tillage, we can get to about a quarter of the total ag emissions. And if we couple that with various practices that target nutrient management, manure management has already been mentioned, conservation crop rotations, mulching, compost, et cetera. There are lots of different ways to get there. So we're making progress.
Do you have some metrics? Do you, like, you know, if we did this much of it, we would get there? Are we able to make those kind of calculations?
We're in progress doing that right now, yeah. I think and I think it's important to mention that the best management or the best practice that has the greatest greenhouse gas reduction isn't the same across the country or even across the state. So it's important to have that regionalization that we mentioned earlier.
If the chair allows, I would certainly welcome any other answers.
Well, it comes down to economics, for sure, and that's how you get a farmer to invest in a new practice. One of the things that we participated earlier with, it was a study from Environmental Defense Fund where do cover crops actually pay for themselves? And we went through it. Our farm was one of about 4 in the whole Midwest, and we went through the whole thing, not necessarily about what it actually contributes to greenhouse gas sequestration, but what is the dollar value for putting those cover crops in place? And we found out from our numbers on our particular farm that the cover crops more than paid for themselves and had a 2 to 5% increase in yield. But what that may seem small, but over the time, over many, more years, your soil becomes much better and more resilient. So you've actually built a lot of risk management by doing that over time. I look at my soil as my 401k. That if and that's the problem with bankers. They look at things on a return on investment for 6 months. You need to look at this as, give it 5 years. You'll get your money back.
Mr. Griffith, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield to Mr. Graves.
My friend who just got an extra minute and a half, is he the one that's objecting? Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Mr. Griffin, for yielding the time. Number one, Madam Chair, I want to point to the IPCC report specifically, the supplement AR5 that refers to the migration to natural gas as a cleaner energy solution, reminding my friends that often cite the IPCC report. Number two, Madam Chair, I'd like to submit for the record a graphic demonstrating the United States has reduced emissions more than the next 12 emissions-reducing countries combined. Number three, I want to submit a graph showing that the state of California and their aggressive green energy solutions have increased their dependence upon Saudi Arabian imports of oil. Number four, I'd like to submit for the record a graphic a news report showing that in the Northeast, their aggressive greenhouse gas reducing policies resulted in increasing the utilization of home heating oil and becoming dependent upon Russian natural gas. Lastly, in response to my friend from Georgia, I'd like to submit week 10, the AP top 25 that shows LSU is number one. And my friend from Georgia is down at number 8. I yield back.
All right,
I appreciate that.
We will review those documents and then handle the UC at the end of it.
And Madam Chair, would you submit all the usual rebuttal documents to
Yes.
the litany?
Reclaiming my time.
Mr. Griffith.
Thank you. Let me just say that coal is not dead either, and that what we have to do is have parity in our research on all of our fuels because coal and natural gas are great. But we have to make sure that we're not increasing our carbon footprint and are in fact reducing that. And a lot of research, and you see clips from Energy and Commerce, and you'll see me talking about all kinds of great research that's going on. That being said, Mr. Amin, how many cows do you need to make it feasible to have one of your anaerobic digesters on your property if you're a farmer? Because most of my farmers are relatively small.
The size can vary quite a bit, and these projects are scalable. So there is no precise formula per se. I can tell you the farms that we've cited at have been anywhere between 1,500 cows per farm to 10,000 cows per farm.
All right, and so the problem is that I don't have that many cows on any single farm in my district. And so that creates a problem. Now, let me ask this, because I do think the concept is one that's worthy. How do you get it to the pipe? How do you get your RNG to the pipe?
We can transport RNG by pipeline through a direct interconnect with a major interstate pipeline, or we can truck the gas there.
So you have to, practically, you'd have to be close enough to a pipeline to make that work.
Practically speaking, yes.
Okay. Now, when you finish getting the methane out of the manure, what do you do with it?
So we take that manure, we don't take the manure, the farmer takes that manure and applies it to the land as fertilizer when the farmer needs it.
So Mr. Yoder could buy some of that if he wanted to put on his property, because I heard him talk about using chicken litter and other types of manure on his property.
I think
All
so.
right, that works. All right, good. We found a way to marry these two, and that's good. Let me get into the broadband discussion with the time that I have left. I represent the most rural parts of the Commonwealth of Virginia, so don't think of my district as being like Northern Virginia and all that traffic. We've got lots of traffic issues on I-81, but once you get off of 81, you don't have that. And we have lots of places, including Montgomery County, home of Virginia Tech, where because of the way the lay of the mountains go, we don't have service. We don't have broadband. You can be 5 miles, 3 miles outside of Blacksburg, Virginia, one of the most wired communities in the country, and not have any service. There is new technology coming for our rural areas. We're working hard to get mapping that's proper, But we have, there's some white space technology out there that I think Microsoft has been working on. There are 2 or 3 companies working on low altitude satellite service. I think within the next few years, we're going to have a lot more broadband available so that our farmers, even on the small farms that don't have 1,000 cows, we can use modern technologies and go forward with that. I do appreciate that as well. Ms. Owens, let's talk soil. Because the problem in the federal government often is that we get into these discussions and we come up with 1 or 2 or 5 sizes. And Mr. Yoder said there are thousands of kinds of soils. And I learned that as a young lawyer when I had a case I thought was a clear winner because somebody had diverted water on somebody else's property and broke the foundation in their house. And then I found out that the soil around that particular house held water to such an extent that it was the natural soil, the water in the soil and not the diversion that popped the foundation. So how do we get a policy when we have thousands of soils? How do we get a policy that everybody can apply?
Well, I am not the scientist on soil. We are working with folks who are scientists on soil, and I think what you've seen is consensus from this panel on the fact that soil is central to the entire equation, as well as the fact that we need a systems approach that is unique to each region of the country.
Well, in this case, it was not only each region, it was like neighborhood to neighborhood. Some neighborhoods have radon, some don't. I mean, it changes. Madam Chair, this is an important discussion. I think there's a lot of common ground, notwithstanding our good-natured poking back and forth. There's a lot of common ground where we can make a positive difference using common sense approaches, particularly in agriculture, to solve some of these problems. I yield back.
I agree. Mr. Caston, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you all so much. So my colleagues have heard me say this before, but my view is that it's super easy to solve the climate crisis. We only have to do 3 things. We have to cut our energy use per dollar of GDP in half, which would take us to where our best-in-class trading partners are. We have to invent whole new technologies to figure out how to decarbonize industries that we have no idea how to decarbonize, like fertilizer manufacturing. And then we have to take about 100 parts per million out of the atmosphere to get back to a stable level. If we do all those 3 things, we're set. The first of those is economically accretive. The second one is potentially accretive because we'll invent whole new industries. The third is really, really hard, except in the agricultural space where, at least theoretically, by increasing soil carbon content and picking on the last, we can increase productivity, and there's some interesting data on how to do that. And so I want to focus on that, and I'd like to start with you, Dr. Kucera. Is it my understanding that most of the programs that encourage various agricultural practices from no-till to cover crops, et cetera, are essentially practice-based rather than performance-based? So in other words, you don't get a differential incentive to do something that's going to raise more carbon. It's do this, do this, do this, do this. Is that a fair characterization?
I'm sorry, I don't totally understand your question.
Well, let me maybe ask it a different way. Congresswoman Brownlee had asked whether a carbon tax or fee or something like that would be appropriate. Do we actually have a way to understand this changing agricultural practice will lead to this much quantifiable, precise change in the carbon absorption in the soil?
There are a variety of tools. The quantification and verification steps with soil carbon is very critical, and a lot more research needs to go in that direction. There's a lot of new novel ways that we can measure carbon quickly, and so developing a platform that's consistent and can be validated across various regions is a critical component. We currently have the ability to do that now. It's just very expensive.
So this was my point about practice-based, because it's really hard if we can't quantify the baseline in a consistent way, then it's hard to know what the change is. But I agree we should do it. Mr. Yoder, can you just help us understand, and if anybody else has insight, Ms. Owens, I know you and I talked about this a little bit yesterday as well. What's the range, and before we get to the actual hard numbers but on a percentage basis, seasonal changes, slope changes, weather changes, soil type changes, what are we talking about with all these various agricultural practices? You know, how wide is the error band, if you will?
It can be very wide. I know one of the things that we're going to have to eventually get to is outcome-based rather than just practice-based. Because Dr. Rutan Lau from Ohio State University has done a lot of work on this, and where we can sequester particular amounts in my soils. If you go to Nebraska, when there's sandy soils, it doesn't work the same. So the same practice has the different results. So that's why we have to really come down and understand each and every soil type and custom create a program that's going to work for that particular soil. It's again, a one-size-fits-all. You're not going to get to where you need to be. If we're going to really make a difference in the climate, we need to have a metric that we can count on, that you do this, this can be counted on to do this much in this particular area. But you can't do that until we finally get a metric that we can count on.
It may mean that we have to stay with a more practice-based system too, but so help me, do any of you have any estimates of, on an absolute basis, what could we do? Because if we got to get 100 parts per million down, that's roughly, if I'm doing my math right, 400 billion tons of CO2 out of the atmosphere. If we're looking at the absolute best possible scenario for changing agricultural practices that we think would increase soil health, are we talking 1% of the way there? Are we talking 50% of the way there? How big is this relative to what we have to do?
Well, you have to look at it, remember I said earlier, you have to look at it on a systems basis, because you're talking about, there's not a silver bullet. There's several different ways. For instance, you can reduce greenhouse gas emissions by reducing your tillage or your trips over the field, or you can reduce your fertilizer use by going on more of a type of that you only fertilize those spots in the field that need it. You can also, depending on what crop you do, whether you're growing hay or whether you're growing corn, it all has to be system-based, because it's not, we can't have a.
So I'm out of time, and I take your point, but I would welcome if any of you have a way, because we have to ultimately figure out how to prioritize the different things we could do. And I think there's something really important here in this panel, but it's really hard to understand, like, yes, all those things individually are good, but if we're going to spend the time, as maybe we should, to say, what is the variance by soil type? I think it would be helpful for us to understand, in the best possible scenario, how big an opportunity is this, so that we can look about that at the other things we're going to have competing resources for. And I'm way over, so thank you, and I yield back.
Ms. Miller, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Castor. For the past, over 20 years, my family and I have owned and operated a bison farm in southern West Virginia. We bought our first bull and 5 females from Minford, Ohio, Mr. Yoder. His name was Buster. And the alpha female was Flossie, and they're both long gone. I've spent many years at farmers markets selling meats and countless hours on the farm, caring for the land, for the animals. And one of the most important things I learned was protecting our land to keep it for generations to come. Probably another important thing I learned was, don't hit an animal on the hind end and expect it to move in the direction you want. Because I have to wear this thing for 6 weeks. We have seen farming evolve across the generations. We've seen farming practices, government suggestions, government programs, even in the 20th centuries, that haven't worked, like planting multiflora rows. That's a mess, and it takes years to clean up. We now see farmers utilizing technology in a precision agriculture. Farmers are also instituting sustainable farming practices that are not only benefiting their crop yield, but also the environment. As we move forward in considering ways to address climate change, it is important that we do not become too prescriptive. Farmers know best how to care for their land without cumbersome government mandates. Most of you know that the average age in America of a farmer is 58 years old. For organic farmers, it's 52 years old. For beginning farmers with less than 5 years of experience, it's 47 years old. So we need to keep that in mind as we move forward. Mr. Amin, is the pipeline infrastructure in the United States adequate to meet the needs of the DTE now and for the expansion of renewable natural gas?
The infrastructure that's in place today is sufficient for what we're doing today. That's correct.
That's good. Are you selling most of your renewable natural gas to particular states?
Most of our renewable natural gas that we produce in Wisconsin is being sold into the state of California.
How are you getting it there?
We're getting there by pipeline.
Okay. Do you think renewable natural gas can help overcome the intermittency problems of other renewable energy sources like wind and solar power?
I do believe so, because renewable natural gas is a dispatchable resource. You can use it when you need it most.
What are the biggest roadblocks in instituting your renewable natural gas technology around the United States?
There's several roadblocks. I would say number one is being able to access the source, the methane source. Generally, we need to be relatively close to a pipeline to be able to make that project work. The farther it is from a pipeline, it's more difficult to access that particular project. So that's probably our number one roadblock.
Thank you. Mr. Yoder, can you describe some of the innovations and advancements in technology that you have seen to assist the farmers?
Sure. One of the things that we first adopted several years ago was variable rate technology on fertilizer. We grid sample all of our fields on actually acre grids. So for every acre, we get an actual reading of what that is. And so when we fertilize, we found out, because we did it originally to cut costs, we found out there was hot spots in the field that didn't need any fertilizer at all. We found other spots that were very low. So we spent the last several years evening things up to try to have more of a uniform field. The problem you also have, though, that you can't do anything about is the soil types. And we saw that this year with our yields this year. We're not quite done yet. We actually came out of the field yesterday from the cornfield to be here today, but we found lower yields this year because of we had a real wet spring, and then we had a very dry July and August. But surprisingly, the way we're farming today, our farm still produced much better than what our neighbors did because of that tilled. The other thing that we have used in our farm is we put precision parts on our planter. It's actually a high-speed kit that we put on, and so we can go now. We got a 40-foot planter that we put at the high speed, which we can go up to 10 miles per hour instead of the normal 5. We don't go that fast, but we basically turned our 40-foot planter into the same amount of capacity as a 60-foot, and we actually cut 3 to 4 days off of our planting. And what my neighbors did is, because they had to wait until they could get to it, they didn't get their planting done. We got everything planted except for about 150 acres. So the technology, but the other thing too is we got all this technology on the planter where we can plant 24 hours in a row, because it's got all readouts. We can understand the seed to soil contact. We can exactly how much seed we're putting on, the varieties of seed. So we're no longer hampered by daylight, which, in the old days, if you plant after dark, you're going to have trouble. Not anymore, because you know exactly, and you're making a map. Every time you make a trip over the field, you're making a map of what you've done. And so there's those two things. Farmers love technology too. And that's the thing. Data is going to be the next big thing that we need to do. If we could get our hands on the data, and just like Tina was talking about, the data that each farm generates is wonderful. But just think if we could get the data that our own U.S. government or USDA has. What if we could put that together and actually have something that we could get some correlations and actually see the trends on a big scale? That'd be wonderful.
Thank you. I yield back my time.
Thank you. Ms. Bonamici, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. Thank you to all the witnesses. I just want to briefly follow up on Mr. Carter's comment that Mr. Huffman followed up on about the rural broadband and how important that is. There's a little farm, Sealy Mint, up in Columbia County, Oregon, where they sustainably harvest spearmint and peppermint. Last time I visited, they said, see the tracks down the road? You have to go over the tracks, and then you have internet. So it's a real challenge with a growing business. But I also wanted to mention, we heard about the importance of small farms in agriculture. Summit Foods in Cornelius, Oregon, which is rural area, pretty far west of Portland. We grow great blueberries in Oregon, and Summit Foods dries them, sells them nationally, internationally. They take the processing waste, which is fermented, and sent to their sister company, Summit Natural Energy, where they make Thunderbolt racing fuel, which the race car drivers like because not only is it 100% renewable, it also is high octane and smells like blueberries. So we're doing creative things in doing our part with agriculture. I just wanted to mention, on the same day in August when the IPCC released its special report on land degradation and sustainable land management, I was visiting 46 North Farm in Astoria, Oregon. 46 North is participating in a dry farming project with partners at Oregon State University's Extension Service. People think, well, it rains all the time in Oregon, but they really don't need to irrigate. Even during a dry season, because they work to conserve soil moisture through a variety of management strategies, like the use of cover crops, which then help them access water and nutrients in the soil later in the growing season. So these practices have allowed them to restore a significant portion of their land, which was heavily degraded from the previous landowner. It's kind of a great example of sustainable agriculture, which of course on a large scale could help reduce emissions, store carbon, and preserve natural habitats, but also providing tasty vegetables and beautiful flowers. Many of our ecosystems have been pushed to the brink with their ability to naturally adapt, but farmers are natural stewards of the land and have direct experience with conserving natural resources, and I know their perspectives are really valuable. Dr. Moore Kucera, Michael? Kucera. Variable precipitation and rising temperatures are intensifying droughts in some places and increasing heavy downpours in others, reducing snowpack, especially in the Pacific Northwest, and leading to significant differences in supply and demand. And it really has changed our crop productivity. So in your testimony, you outlined the substantial greenhouse gas emission reductions from cover crop and conservation tillage, and you noted that the real and perceived risks that farmers face when considering how to adopt strategies. So as water supply changes in the Northwest in the face of the climate crisis, how can we effectively incentivize and encourage more farmers to transition to no-till, dry farming, and cover cropping practices?
Yes, thank you for that question. The climate discussions must also include discussions around water, not only water quality, like I mentioned, but water quantity and availability. And so all of the soil health practices that I mentioned earlier help to get water into the ground, and that water is then available later for the plant. So that's a win-win for sure. You asked about how we can help promote those different practices and break down the barriers. I think it was alluded to earlier, but the relationship building is critical between farmers and conservationists. And so communicating that, getting workshops, hearing where the farmers are, where they are in their success, where they are in their challenges is critical to help move some of those programs forward.
Thank you. And to you and also Mr. Yoder, we know that smart agriculture practices have other benefits like reducing fertilizer runoff. I am the co-chair of the Oceans Caucus and the Estuaries Caucus, been concerned about runoff and pollution from human activities, increasing the presence of harmful algal blooms or HABs in marine, coastal, estuary, and freshwater systems, and that's happened in every state. So I wonder about how healthy soils, reducing dependence on fertilizers, and I worked on pesticide reduction programs when I was in the state legislature. What are some other benefits and how can of healthy soil stewardship practices, and how can we effectively reduce those pollutant inputs to maximize the benefits to our soil?
Well, again, I go back to the economic reasoning. Okay, for instance, I'm from Ohio, and we had some challenges with algal blooms in the Lake Erie Basin because of the Northwest Ohio. That's been blamed for a lot of it. We have a lot of dissolved reactive phosphorus moving, which we never thought we'd ever. When I was in college and you talked about phosphorus, it never moved more than 2 inches forever. Well, dissolved reactive phosphorus does. So what we're trying to do is figure out soil amendments to stabilize those nutrients, and the best way you can do that is a cover crop, because it just basically takes up all the unused nutrients and waits for the next crop. So but it does that, but it also, in economic reasons, you can actually lose, and I use this argument all the time with farmers, over $100 an acre of some of the nutrients worth that you see go off your farm. That's money. $1 saved is better than $1 on the gross. So farmers are saying, hey, if I can save this, so what you do is, these farmers that put on the nitrogen and the phosphorus in the fall, and they know half of it's gonna be gone, that doesn't make sense. And so we've moved to a as-needed basis. Basically, you feed the crop as you take it. And you do tissue tests and you find out what's it needing, instead of just put it all on and get it out of the way. We have to change our thinking about that, but you gotta really stress the economic value of that. And when farmers see the economic values, they'll change, but they're not interested in, and that's why I said before, it's always controversial. They don't want to talk about climate change, but they'll sure talk about weather pattern changes. So that's what they do.
Thank you. I'm out of time. Yield back.
Mr. Palmer, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Yoder, I'm interested in your no-till farming. I own timberland, and we have green fields for wildlife, and we did no-till this time. But are you doing corn no-till?
We are. We're 100% no-till.
How do you do that when your seed has to be at a certain depth, soil depth?
There are so many new tools and technology. Our planter's got the latest. It's
You do
actually
drilling? Is that?
Excuse me?
You're doing drilling or what?
No, it's actually a planter, but we control the downforce. We call Delta Force. That's our brand name. But we can literally put enormous amount of pressure to get it down to where we used to have just springs keeping it down, and then you get a tough spot, it'd rise up, and then you wouldn't get your depth. This guarantees it's going to be a certain depth. And the other thing too about no-till is after continuous no-till, your ground actually gets looser, and so you can be more precise. And we also have indications of seed to soil contact. We have indications of dropping doubles or skips and things like that. So when we go through the plant with the planter, we can actually know way more than we did when we used to have to stop and dig it out and see what it's like. So technology has been a tremendous tool for our efficiency.
All right, I didn't think you were just throwing seed on top of the ground, so I knew you had to penetrate the soil in some fashion. I just want to share something with you and just get your response to it. And the statement was that the greenhouse effect would be desolating the heartlands of North American Eurasia with horrific drought causing crop failures and food riots. The Platte River in Nebraska would be dry while a continent-wide black blizzard of prairie topsoil will stop traffic on interstate, strip paint from houses, and shut down computers. Do you anticipate that?
I hope not.
Well,
One of the things
I'm asking.
Well, this is what I'm stressing.
Any of you?
I think you're going to be more effective with, instead of scare tactics like what you've been hearing, to show farmers the economic value of changing their practices, what they've been doing. Not only cutting their costs, but increasing their yields. And if that's going to be a way to a solution for climate change, then that'll just help things along. But
My question is to the entire panel, Ms. Moore, Kucera, is that a reasonable expectation as an outcome for failing to eliminate all carbon emissions?
I just think that there's a lot of hope and there's a lot of opportunities,
Now,
so.
I'm asking, is this a reasonable expectation? It's a yes or no. The answer, okay, you won't answer. How about you, Ms. Owens?
I would say that we should reasonably expect to see some of our societal fabric break down if we continue on this path of extreme climate change.
Mr. Amin?
So this is not an area of my expertise per se, so I'll defer that question.
Okay, thank you. That was from Michael Oppenheimer, who's a climate scientist and the Albert G. Milbank Professor of Geoscience and International Affairs at the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs at Princeton University, and he said that in 1990. And he predicted that by 1995. He also said that Mexican police will round up illegal American migrants surging into Mexico seeking work as field hands. A lot of my problem with this, and I understand the climate is changing. The geological record shows that. And we are so wrapped around the axle about carbon when I think there were 3 scientists were all witnesses called by the majority that admitted that if we completely eliminated all carbon emissions, went to zero emissions, it would not stop climate change. That was an accurate answer. It will not stop it. The geologic record shows that the climate is changing. It will continue to change. And to some of what you've talked about, Mr. Yoder, in regard to the technology and Mr. Amin, the science behind renewable natural gas, is, I think, how we ought to be approaching this. We need to be looking for adaptation and mitigation solutions because it's coming no matter what we do. But all we're doing is talking about eliminating CO2, and I'm for reducing carbon emissions. I'm for, we've done a tremendous job in the last 30, 40 years in regard to the 6 criteria pollutants that the EPA tracks in reducing that. In terms of farming, I mean, we basically have an agricultural miracle that's played out over the last 50 years. So my point is that I want us to get serious about being prepared for the climate change that's coming and not buy into a lot of the fake science. With that, Madam Chairman, I yield back.
Perfect. Next, Ms. Pingree, we're going to recognize you for 5 minutes. Thank you for your interest in this hearing. Ms. Pingree is a farmer herself and one of the members of Congress we look to for expertise in this area. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. Thanks to you and the ranking member and the members of the committee for letting me sit in on what's been a very interesting hearing. Thank you to the panel for really great testimony and really to the committee for such good questions and truly some bipartisan areas of agreement. So it's been a pleasure to be able to be in here with all of you. I am particularly interested in this. I've been an organic farmer since the 1970s, and I've seen a huge transition of when that was sort of a funny back to the land idea to a $50 billion industry. And so many practices that happen in organic agriculture are the things you're talking about today, particularly cover crops and composting. I'm working myself on a bill related to agriculture and climate change, and so many of the pieces that people have been talking about today are part of that. I have sort of 5-part strategy, which is support soil health, promote pasture-based livestock, preserve farmland, support on-farm and renewable energy, and reduce food waste. So you've all kind of covered it a little bit. Food waste didn't come up, but you know, just to mention to the committee, in Maine, we have one big biodigester that collects from a dairy farm, but also collects a tremendous amount of food waste as well and biodigests together, and then produces electricity on site, so there's actually no transportation. I also am very, very interested in some of the questions that came up around the metrics of understanding how much carbon is sequestered in the soil, and that's one area that got talked about a little bit, but not developed as much today. And I've certainly met with a lot of different organizations and university people who are trying to crack this nut of, you know, how do we look at the outcomes, and then how do we pay farmers for the performance? And I'm interested just for any of you who want to answer, I mean, one idea is that farmers could participate in carbon markets. I come from actually the most forested state in the nation, so we've been able to take advantage. Sorry, I did mention it to Mr. My friend from Georgia as well. But we've been able to take advantage a lot of the offsets because we have that. But we also have hundreds of years of developing an understanding of how much carbon is produced in a tree. So a lot of this is new, but we would like to see farmers take advantage of that. So if you were able to participate in a carbon market, if there were some metrics that we could all agree on, either developed through the USDA or one of these many programs, what do you see as the benefit of that? And also, I would say there's some talk of a tax credit on this. We give a tax credit to wind and solar. What about a tax credit on carbon produced? So that's just an area of interest, and go ahead and add in whatever you think.
Well, I thank you for that question. One of the things that we deal with a lot is if what's good for the land and what's good for the farmer, we also have to get buy-in from the landowner. And one of the problems we have is an awful lot of land is leased on a yearly basis, and how do you, for the most you can get it out of that money, or for money you can get for that land, how do you convince a landowner that these practices, which may be different than what the farmer's been doing, that it's worth it? And so that's why I think a tax credit or something like that would be really helpful. The other thing too is I would like to see us develop some different programs just as a starter, just to get farmers to stick their toe in the water and try something. I have never taken any money to try these new practices. Actually did it, I started no-till to save money. But today, I would never go back to farming like I used to because I've seen the value and the resilience of my soil. You know, for every 1% organic matter that you increase in your soil, you can, 20 to 25,000 gallon more capacity for holding water. And so if you look at that way, and that's how you get to farmers. It's managing that risk. It's making your stuff more resilient and that they can actually have an economic gain for it. But things that we got to figure out a way to get all farmers interested in looking at different ways to do things.
So Owens.
I'd like to add a bit to that. So Mr. Yoder actually talked very, very well about some of the practices that lead to resiliency, economic resiliency within farms. And I think that that's a much more immediate approach that we can take, given what we have available using the NRCS resources and the Farm Bill and other things at our disposal. We are actually, as a company, at the table having the conversation around an eventual carbon market. We're supporters of it. There's a lot of consensus that needs to happen in order for that to get off the ground. What we can show farmers today is a way to use existing tools, data, and the practices that we've talked about several times as a panel on how they can actually impact their profitability starting within 2, 3, or less years. That they actually can really move the needle. There's some great case studies that we'd like to point to. AFT actually published some using funding from NRCS. There's a company called Day 2 Research that also has open case studies that very specifically shows in states like Illinois, Ohio, and other Midwestern states that there is a very real profitability model here for farmers to adopt, and that is much more tangible, real, and been demonstrated by farmers such as Mr. Yoder.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I'm out of time. Thank you so much for letting me sit in.
Thank you for your interest. I'd like to thank our witnesses for your testimony today. It's been very helpful. The committee is currently accepting policy proposals. If anyone has a policy proposal beyond the ones addressed today, please go to our website at house.climatecrisis.gov. We have a request for information. The due date is November 22nd. So if you have some other institutions or advocates or interested parties, other farmers who would like to submit some ideas to the committee, please pass that along. At this time, I'd like to ask unanimous consent to add to the hearing record, number 1, a letter from the Defenders of Wildlife with their policy recommendations, and number 2, a policy paper from the Breakthrough Institute. And any additional questions for the witnesses, members will have 10 business days within which to submit those, and I ask all of the witnesses to respond. Did you have
I just wanted to make sure that our pile of documents was submitted, and also I'd left out a letter by Senators, this is Mr. Huffman's favorite, letter by Senators Schumer, Menendez, Markey, and Cantwell, asking that we increase global oil production. Sometimes the truth hurts.
They did over a year ago. Okay. So without objection, those will be incorporated into the record. Thanks again, everyone. The hearing is adjourned.